Chapter 16. Under the Black House. Kendra blinked in wonder as she stepped out from the cellar into a rough, open corridor. She was on the shelf of a cliff in a narrow grotto, not quite able to touch the far wall. There was a sheen to the place, every surface covered in a thin coat of condensation. The very air carried a humid dampness that might have been stuffy had it not been for a gentle breeze whistling down along some distant passage. Almost every inch of the walls were occupied by patches of mushrooms, some wide and flat, some bursting up in clusters from tiny nooks, others dangling in wispy, curly clumps. They were the source of the light, delicate, but clear enough for the enclosed space. Kendra was gaping in awe when she started and nearly slipped. She had not realized how treacherous her footing truly was, but Maya laid out a thick arm in front of her. Still, she turned and stared searchingly, for she thought she had heard a voice, sonorous and near, murmuring at her shoulder, almost singing. "It's the cave song," Maya said conversationally, still holding her up without comment. "There are a few narrow places twisted around, and here and there it focuses the wind down through a funnel until the sound gets all coiled and loops round into a little whisper. Sometimes, on a real blustery sort of day, you can get a properly musical sort of chat going." Kendra did not immediately respond, for it was then that she saw Maya in the light for the first time, and only long-trained habits of courtesy prevented her from openly gaping. The dwarf looked as if a long-forgotten statue had given a stretch and a yawn, stepped down from its pedestal, and gone for a stroll. A dense layer of accumulated detritus covered her nearly as thickly as the walls. She was covered in ingrained grime, and in many places had mushrooms growing through the tattered rags that were all that remained of a loose robe that might have once been white. But the most startling part of her disheveled appearance was her eyes. One was almost fully obscured by the cap of a mushroom that seemed to be growing out of her lower lid like a window planter. The other was a pale purple sphere, devoid of any apparent retina or iris. Maya smiled vaguely, not quite facing Kendra, and plucked the mushroom out of her eye with a squelch that left Kendra slightly queasy. "Please excuse my attire," she said, with the mildness of a dinner host caught in her slippers. "I've not had occasion for moving about much lately, and it's been longer still since I last received any guests." "It's quite all right," Kendra said, unable to hide her concern. Are you quite all right?" Silence hung between them, sudden and surprising. Only the sleepy murmuring of the twisting grottos could be heard. Maya stood with an expression Kendra could not quite read, solemn and thoughtful. "Not yet," she finally answered, smile softly renewed. Then she began to walk. "Come, things are moving quickly now. This will take some getting used to." They cut a strange picture, the trio navigating the gently glowing passageways of the black house's twisting underbelly. Maya stumped along at the head of the column, inelegantly sure-footed, a constant rambling hum of chatter echoing in her wake. Kendra walked close behind her, picking her way nervously over the narrow, slick surface, trying not to look down. Lastly, Caleb brought up the rear, near silent with his usual cat-like grace, an image of unperturbed cool marred only slightly by the wrinkle of distaste in his nose. "It took a while to give everything its full consideration," Maya said matter-of-factly, "but it's well past time for me to be moving along. I spent a long time thinking, and more importantly, a long time not thinking at all. My home and people have been destroyed, and I can't really say why or how. But you two appeared, and the both of you with the smell of real portent about you. There's a storm brewing on y'all, make no mistake, but maybe there's a way to ride it out. I think there's only one thing for it. I need to see the sisters." Caleb snorted. "Easier said than done. As a general rule, you don't see the sisters see you." "Why's that?" asked Kendra. "I thought the sisters were like, I don't know, the queens of the garden. You live in their realm. Isn't there some way to be granted an audience?" Caleb shook his head, laughing. "The sisters aren't queens. Nothing so simple as that. Queens inherent governance of a land. The sisters made this land. It is theirs, and of them. It wouldn't be far off to say that the garden is an extension of themselves, their artistic vision. The sisters are functionally eternal, incredibly powerful, and for the most part disinterested in the day-to-day affairs of the world." Kendra's brow furrowed with curiosity. "What is it they're so interested in, then? They've been around for centuries. What do they do?" Caleb shrugged. "What do you do when you're a goddess? Whatever you please. They've been cultivating the garden for eons, and they don't exactly take visitors. I told you, they're not interested. It would seem that they're preoccupied with higher matters." "Not entirely," Maya disagreed mildly. They were passing through a wider area of the caves now, and the ledge gave way to a floor of great mushroom caps above the abyss. Maya began to blithely hop between them, goat-like, the caps swaying gently beneath her. "The sisters do take at least some interest in the inhabitants of the garden. When the Sylvan refugees were cornered and fleeing to the garden, they were able to enter, to make a home here. The humans that pursued them generally haven't been so fortunate. The meaning couldn't be plainer. Even out of sight, we know we have the sisters' favor." "That's certainly one interpretation," Caleb said with forced patience. "But the fact remains that hardly anyone ever does actually meet them. There have been those foolish enough to try to force the issue, and most were sent away with painful lessons in respect for privacy. There's no reason they'll see you." "They'll see me," Maya said confidently. "I have what others before me didn't have." "What's that?" Kendra asked curiously, forestalling Caleb's irritation. She very carefully did not look down as she stepped between the waving caps. They stretched out before her like barrels bobbing on the current over unseen depths. "I have news that they won't," Maya said frankly. "Something is loose that attacked my people and spread sickness and rot in the garden. You've encountered something similar. In other words, something is interfering with the balance of things, their established order. And now you can come along and say your piece. If the familiars are in a fix, the sisters need to know about it." There was a painful silence for several moments. "Maya," Kendra said anxiously, We're trying to leave the garden. I need to go home. I don't have much time to catch up to my caravan, and if I miss it, I'll be stranded a long way from anywhere." "You want to leave the garden?" Maya asked blankly. "Why?" "Oh, well, The breadth of the simple question was stunning. What was there for her, really? She'd given up her home. She was nearly friendless. These last few days had been terrifying, certainly, but not without a sort of wonder. Why did she have to leave the garden? "Of course she wants to go back," Caleb cut in dismissively. "She's a human. Her place is out there, with her own kind. She doesn't belong here." Maya shrugged, but said nothing, as Kendra was struck with a dull sinking sensation. She could not deny the truth of it. In her short time here, she'd wrought terrible consequences upon those around her. On Adrian, on his brother. What right did she really have to this place? "And anyway," he plowed on, "it's a terribly dangerous thing you're talking about. We'd have to enter one of the citadels, uninvited, with nothing but a claim that they want to talk to us. Those towers are supposed to be damned near labyrinths, and very well protected to boot. It's utter madness." Maya gave another small shrug. "It's a road I must walk. If anything can help the dwarves, it's the sisters. Though I will say this, it'll take more than a labyrinth to turn my head. No one can find their way in the dark like a dwarf." And there was a distinct note of defiant pride in her voice now. "If that's how you insist that it has to be, that's your affair," Caleb retorted sharply. "My only business is keeping Kendra safe and getting her home. We're not taking on some hopeless errand. What you're talking about is practically suicide." "I thought you might regard it as fit payment for me guiding you out of here," Maya said, and for the first time she sounded just a little nettled. "I can't imagine how long it would take you to navigate these tunnels on your own. For that matter, y'all might still be stuck in a basement if I'd not come along." Caleb breathed in angrily, but Kendra spoke quickly. "Just how far out of the way is it?" "Kendra!" Caleb hissed irritably, but she held a calming palm to him. "There's no reason we can't talk about it," she continued evenly. "You said you think you could get through one of these citadels without too much trouble." "If y'all mean to leave through the tiers," Maya replied, now resuming her pleasantly rambling demeanor, "then it's not far out of the way at all. It all sits near enough down to the southern border of the garden. I can't say for certain just how long it will all take, but it would certainly be easier with a little help, a bit of company. It can be—" She paused, momentarily lost. "It can be hard to stay on track when I'm on my own. I've been alone with my thoughts for a long time." Kendra tensed, half expecting Caleb to sound off again, but for once he was silent. "We do appreciate you helping us," Kendra eventually replied. "It means a lot to us, and I do owe a lot to some other people as well. If Adrian and his family need help, I'd like to give it if I can. And if nothing else, we can continue together for a while. It sounds like we're heading nearly to the same place. We'll have plenty of time to think it all through on the way." "A little consideration is all I can ask for," Maya said lightly. "And I reckon it'll be a real pleasant thing to have you as a companion. Your friend can come too." They walked on quietly for a while from there, Maya humming in tune to the song of the cave. Kendra continued hopping in her wake, feeling an odd sense of pleased relief. She pushed on with more purpose than she had felt all week, and so she did not notice the gleam in Caleb's eyes as he followed behind them, brooding and grim. They came to the end of the field of caps, to an alcove against a stony wall, and it was a great comfort to have solid, inorganic ground beneath her feet again. Towards the back of the cavity there was an oddly smooth patch that Kendra could not immediately identify until Maya pulled it aside. It was a sort of porthole, a doorway of the same gleaming chitinous material that the furniture had been made of. "There are a fair number of cellars that connect down to these canals," Maya explained. "That's good for us, because even though most of these passageways are interconnected somehow, there's not always an easy path cleared out to get through them, given that they're mostly natural. We're going to have to cut across the surface for a little ways, until we make our way to the next opening in the caves." "Back to the surface?" Kendra asked nervously. Her stomach churned just to consider those monsters, those ruined people above. Having a good look at Maya, she could now see the unfortunate resemblance in the stony skin, in their thick, stocky physiques. But where Maya sported a placid smile, only a gaping hole would remain. "Are you sure you know how to get to the next cellar?" Caleb asked. Kendra gave him some credit. He mostly kept the skepticism out of his voice. Maya straightened up with pride. "This was my home. I know it's every inch, above and below. What's the expression your kind likes to use? I could walk from one end of the black house to the other blindfolded." A small grin quirked at her lips as she stared forward, gaze unmoving with her unsettling lilac eyes. Can you really not see?" Kendra had been holding back the question. It struck her as somehow rude. "I mean, you navigate the tunnels, very skillfully," she appended hurriedly. She'd heard stories of dwarves like foul and ghoulish worms, eating the dead, burrowing in decay, but those stories did not seem to match the odd but congenial woman before her. Maya chuckled. "All dwarves are blind, Miss Kendra," she said, clearly amused. "We have been as long as anyone can remember. Some say that the gods cursed us, leaving us stunted, sightless little creatures. I think the truth is more likely that dwarves didn't have much cause for sight. Walk in the deep tunnels of the earth, far away from the sun. Our skin is pale and unburnt, our stature is low and compact, and our eyes were unused for so long that we lost the knack. But I feel and hear everything around me, every tremor, every vibration. I'll lead you true, Kendra. Just stay quiet and stay close." With that, she stepped forward, beckoning them on. The cellar they entered was not dissimilar to the one Maya had found them in. It quickly winked into darkness as they left the luminous glow of the cave mushrooms behind, but in short order Maya was prying open a ceiling panel of the familiar chitinous material, and their eyes, now attuned to even the feeblest beams of light, took in this new room. It was much the same grim scene that they'd found in the last home. The room was scattered with debris of broken furniture and streaks of dry black sludge across the walls and floor. In the corner there stood tubs of some craft work, now long stained and empty of whatever their proper contents had been. Kendra began to walk forward, but she almost immediately bumped into Maya, who was standing completely still. A faint wheezing carried over the stagnant air from some ways ahead of them. The door to the house had been badly broken, its top half collapsed where someone had forced their way through. Kendra peered curiously over Maya's shoulder, before she, too, froze. Not 10 paces ahead of them, a faceless statue stood erect, framed against the column of sunlight in the middle distance. Its skin almost glowed with a marble-white sheen, marred by the dribbling blackness that slipped over the remains of its jaw and down its chest. It was heaving, as if breathing heavily, but otherwise was still. Kendra tensed. It was very close, and she knew firsthand just how fast they could be. She might have started scrambling back to the cellar door then and there, but Maya gave her pause. The dwarf was standing in a solid stance, legs apart, arms crossed. She looked on sightlessly with an expression that was not concerned, merely sad. They all stood for a long time, the air thick to bursting, before the monstrous dwarf gurgled and began to stagger off, moved by some unknown prompt, away. Kendra loosed the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Whatever's happened to them, it's blunted their senses," Maya whispered calmly. "Ordinarily, it'd be near impossible to get the jump on a dwarf, but these poor devils, they can barely hear, can't properly feel the movements about them. hardly know what's going on around them. They're sinking further and further into the dark, alone in their heads." With a heaviness to her bearing, she turned away. "Come on, stay on me as close and silent as you can." The path Maya led them by was laborious and disorienting. Between the muggy heat hanging over the boggy ground and their circuitously winding route, the journey had an almost dreamlike character to it. At times they doubled back, or stopped and waited, or switched between lanes of sickly fungi as Maya turned her head carefully, picking their path with deliberation and painstaking patience. Her previous chatter had ceased. She was singular in her focus, every step taken with purpose and consideration. And always, just out of sight, there were the sounds of dragging, moaning, gurgling. They had been passing under the drooping caps of a dilapidated, almost mutated row of mushrooms when they came abruptly into open ground. The column of sunlight rose up before them, seeming almost jewel-encrusted in the resplendent shimmering of its shifting motes, but that was not what caught Kendra's eye. There, at the very center of the black house, was the remains of an ebony box unlike anything else she had seen that day. It was low and rectangular where it was intact, bathed in the fountain of light, but it did not reflect even a twinkle. If anything, the broken monument seemed to swallow it all, a hungry fragment of night. Maya did not stop, skirting along the edge of the little clearing around the structure, and Kendra followed her lead. Still, she shot it furtive glances, reticent to look at it directly. "What is that?" she asked Maya, cautiously hushed. The ominous shuffling around them had diminished, but it left Kendra no more at ease. There was an unsettling, listening quality to that thing. "Couldn't say exactly," Maya whispered back. "It was here when my people first arrived. Sister's business, they figured. Everyone always gave it a wide berth." "Uncharacteristically sensible," Caleb murmured. "I'll be much happier when we're away from it." "Yes," Maya agreed seriously. "It wasn't broken open the last time I saw it." With a shiver, Kendra picked up her pace and tried not to think of how much it resembled a coffin. They passed quickly into the foliage beyond, and she continued to look back long after it had disappeared from view. Their progress was slow and nerve-wracking, but quite suddenly they found themselves beneath the cap of another looming mushroom house. Maya nodded, evidently pleased with herself. "Here we are," she said, quietly triumphant. They quickly passed into the structure, and Kendra breathed a small sigh of relief to be out of sight again. "Just give me a minute," Maya said, with a bit more of her usual swagger. "I need something from upstairs. I think it ought to be here." With that, she waddled up the steep staircase with galumphing ease. Kendra couldn't help it. She giggled. Caleb, however, still wore his sour expression. "Gods, Caleb," she muttered, a little exasperated, but conscious of the stomping footsteps above her. "Why did you have such an axe to grind with her? She's helping us, and besides, she seems, well, kind of fun." Caleb was unmoved. "Elves and dwarves don't get along, as a general rule. We might be here all day if I really dug into the history of it, but suffice it to say, we've been butting heads whenever we met for millennia. Their being illiterate might have something to do with it. Culturally, we're just too different to get along. Dwarves have no appreciation for our work." "That's silly," Kendra said impatiently. "You don't even know Maya." I don't need to meet a particular pig to tell you its opinion on philosophy, he muttered stubbornly. I'm a scholar. I study. I seek out truth. When she had a problem, she chose to sit in a hole in the ground. Big talk, considering we were trapped in said hole, Kendra said with a small smirk. We'd be in real trouble if she hadn't been there. Caleb glared. Be that as it may, he said between grinding teeth, it's not as if I'm rejecting her assistance. For the time being, it would appear we're traveling companions, though I'll remind you that she's hoping to drag you into some very foolish and very dangerous nonsense. Just don't ask me to like her, or her constant chatter. Kendra's eyebrows shot up. You don't like that she's a big talker? She asked in an incredulous whisper. Caleb, do you by any chance recall the other evening when I asked what herb you put in the stew, and you then took it upon yourself to tell me about its life cycle, its relatives, where the name was derived from, and its historical significance? That was intended to be informative, Caleb spluttered, reddening noticeably. If you would prefer I say nothing, then I certainly won't bother. Caleb, Kendra said, soothing but emphatic, I do like your impromptu lectures. They're usually interesting, and you're very knowledgeable, and frankly, it's a little cute when you get all excited about explaining something. But maybe, just maybe, one of the reasons you're so hell-bent on disliking Maya is that she's a little too much like you, and you'd prefer not to share the stage. Caleb's mouth opened and closed several times, but he did not reply, obviously flustered. I appreciate you, Kendra whispered, smiling raggedly, but with as much affection as she could muster. You've been an inexpressible help and comfort, and for all your roughness, I like you. And I imagine that, for much the same reasons, I'm going to like Maya too. They fell into silence for several long moments before Maya came thumping down the stairwell, carrying an oddly shaped bundle under one arm. All set, she said brightly, a noticeable cheer in her features. She cracked open the cellar door and waved grandiosely. And thank you for your kind words, Miss Kendra. I imagine I'll quite come to like you, too. Kendra blanched before subsiding into furious blushing. Beside her, Caleb sighed. The other thing about traveling with dwarves, he said resignedly, is that you'll never have a private conversation again. So they crept, weaving through tunnels, climbing up, skirting quietly along the surface, passing back down again. They had been laboriously picking their way out of a cavern full of strange mineral formations hanging down or protruding up, almost entirely coated in rough orange growth. So it was that they made their way to the surface a third time. Kendra had allowed herself a small sigh of relief. The endless stretches of sprawling fields were no better, but nonetheless, the odor of that particular fungi had been thoroughly stifling. Even Caleb had been affected, his stoic mask showing cracks after an hour. He did not seem to share in her relief, however. A frown creased his face, and he made his way quickly to one of the mushroom cottage's small round windows. Slowly, frown deepening, his eyebrows knitted together pensively as he stared up. It's too dark, he said at last. The sunspot at the top of the dome's been covered. Kendra blinked in surprise. It was gloomier, the sole illumination being the blues and purples of the many fungi hanging down from the high ceiling. Then she shrugged. We were down there for a long time, she pointed out. It's got to be getting late. We've been here for most of the day. He shook his head violently. It's not so late. We've got an hour of daylight left at least. Maya smiled broadly. Have no fear, Master Elf. Day or night, light or dark, I'll keep you on course. She gave him a comforting slap on the back, which he twisted away from, agitated. I'm not scared of the dark, he growled irritably. I'm worried about what comes with it. What comes with the storm that's been on our tail. Kendra's stomach plunged, and she swallowed before nodding. Maybe we'd better be going quickly, please, she said to Maya, trying not to seem overly anxious. The dwarf nodded, more serious now, and they set off. Their pace slowed further still. As that tiny column of sunlight dwindled into nothingness some ways behind them, the ruined creatures in the field seemed to grow restless. There was howling audible now and then, cries going up into the darkness all around them. The monstrous dwarves were stirring to a frenzy, and Maya was working even harder to keep them out of sight, changing courses abruptly and often, crouching in clumps of slimy mushroom stalks for minutes on end. The things were passing closer now, their ambient gurglings and draggings a regular background to their flight. Above them, and still not very far behind, lightning flashed through the pinpoint in the ceiling, accompanied almost immediately by a heavy boom of thunder. Kendra winced, dazzled by the sudden burst of light, and she looked up, shielding her eyes. She paused momentarily, even as Maya and Caleb doggedly followed the path, and so only she saw the silhouette as lightning cracked a second time. Far above, tiny in darkness, something cast a dark outline against the pregnant underbellies of the clouds, lit momentarily white in the storm's tumult. She only saw it a moment before it was gone, but she was certain. Blood chilled, she hurried to catch up to her companions. "Caleb," she whispered urgently, I think it's here." They stopped, looking intently into the murky distance, the enormous room a mass of shifting shadows in the gentle luminance beneath rolling storm clouds. Visibility was dismal. Then another clap and flash from the storm, casting the dome into brilliant relief, and for an instant they saw it, a figure, small and humanoid, falling through open air. Then darkness again. For several long moments they held their breath, and some ways away, not far enough by any stretch of the imagination, they heard a splattering, meaty thud. Around them, the pained, strangled cries began to rise, more and more, until they were at the center of a roaring cacophony that drowned out the thunder. Caleb gestured to Maya with heated urgency, and they began to move again, faster now. Any hopes they'd had of moving unseen were quickly dashed. Maya tried to thread them a path through, but it was futile. There were simply too many of the terrible things, milling around like 1,000 grubs under an upturned stone. They had been crouched behind a hedgerow, waiting for whatever was before them to pass, when Maya shook her head. "We're about to be caught," she said, a grim smile at her lips. "Afraid there's no more use in trying to hide. Time to run." At that moment, they heard the scratching and scraping as a stumbling figure began to turn a corner onto their row. With more speed than Kendra had thought the dwarf possessed, she burst forcefully through the chitinous barrier, rushing down at the surprised monstrosity that had been lurking on the other side. Her movements were quick, but somehow still looked almost unhurried. She caught the faceless horror in the knees, rocking it back, before shoving its shoulder and sending it toppling into the muck. Without so much as looking down, she pushed past it and ran, Kendra and Caleb close on her heels. Those broken shells of people were closing on all sides now, wailing their anguish and hate, grasping, tearing, screaming. Caleb and Maya pushed forth as her vanguards, crashing through row after row of the heavy, wet fungus, fending off the statues come to terrible unlife. Caleb moved like a wildcat, grabbing and flinging with frenzied energy, his eyes a towering inferno. Beside him, Maya slid past her foes like a fish in water, rolling along the current of the violence, pushing through deliberately, turning them back, always moving. They fought like Valkyries, but their strength was being sorely tested, and they were beginning to sustain injuries. Maya's hair had come free of the heavy bun that held it, a cut on her forehead bleeding freely, while Caleb was breathing hard, gripping his chest where one had caught him on his cracked ribs. And behind them, the swarm was growing, as those that they knocked down pulled themselves to their feet, unfazed, and pursued. There were too many of them. The monsters came from all sides, descending in droves, and finally one slipped past Kendra's guard. It came unseen from one side, where Caleb had passed just moments before, and slammed bodily against her, pinning her into the suffocating black mud. She thrashed, not even able to scream, as the air was driven from her lungs, the muck pouring over her, all as its reeking maw spattered in her face. It was off her in a heartbeat. Caleb, roaring like a demon, had lifted it bodily, sent it flying back into the horde. In bare moments they were pulling her out of the mud, onto her feet, but it was already too late. They had been cut off, and their pursuers were upon them. The awful wailing was everywhere now. Caleb's head was turning in short, jerky motions, a caged animal, while Maya settled into a stance of grim readiness. Kendra could only suck in shaky breaths, winded and half-dazed, as the hopelessness of the nightmarish scene pressed in on her. A shadow fell over them. Kendra turned to the sky, wiping the filth from her eyes, and her jaw dropped. At first she could not take it in, for there was so much. The shape loomed immediate and enormous over her, as if all the mushrooms had risen into a great wave. Then she saw its rough skin, its heavy-capped head, the crusty drying wound in its arm, and she knew it was the Moonlight. "He came back," she said, disbelieving. It regarded her with its deep, unfathomable eyes, then rumbled in its strange, nearly unintelligible way, "Go, friend." Then it rose, its full height hulking over her, and bellowed its deafening fury. With long, swinging blows, it swept the monsters from their path. Caleb pulled her on, and Kendra followed, too exhausted and frantic for thought. She looked back as they ran on. The Moonlight was being overwhelmed. They were ripping at its legs, latching on like leeches, and when the huge creature managed to pry one loose, it came away with an oozing chunk of the chitinous flesh. For a moment Kendra paused, her heart in her throat, as she saw them crawling up its arms, clawing and gnawing, biting at its neck and face. She looked, and it looked back. It held her gaze for what felt like a very long time, though it was almost certainly only a heartbeat. Then the monsters were pulling on its cap, and it went tumbling down with a heavy thud, out of sight. "Kendra, we have to go!" yelled Caleb, pulling at her shoulder. Eyes hot and stinging, she followed. They made it to the next house near the end of their strength, the horde relentless at their back. They shoved hastily past the last few snarling forms and flung themselves through the door, slamming it closed behind them. The crashes against it began within moments as their pursuers began to surround them and throw themselves against the walls and doors and windows. Feverishly, the trio made their way to the small cellar door, much like all the ones before it, and quickly dropped into darkness. Hurrying through the small tunnel with ragged breaths, they made their way down, back to the winding caves. Above, the crashing and screaming was growing fainter, more distant. "We should be close now," Maya panted. "There's an outlet from the caves, not far away. It's a pretty straight shot, and we'll be clear of the black house." They passed back into the natural caves now, winding ledges over steep precipices, running water far below. "We might just get ourselves out of—" A great, shuddering boom rang through the caverns. It was hard to say exactly how far it was, echoing resonantly in the narrow spaces, but it was clearly the product of some immense force. They stopped, holding tight to the walls, as for a moment their tiny shelf trembled ominously. Then it passed into quiet again, impenetrable and unfriendly. Wordlessly, they began their march again, each trying to keep the dread from their hearts. They turned a corner into a cloud of billowing dust, clearing quickly in the sticky, humid air. Crouching, insect-like, half-shrouded, there was a shock of red hair and that familiar, terrible smile. The face-stealer waited on the edge of a long gap in the ledge, still crumbling away in waves of root, pebble, and sand in the wake of some titanic act of violence. It took no notice of the destruction, barring their way with what might have been simple delight. But there was no joy in those eyes. They were utterly hollow, some reptilian predator, devoid of any sort of human feeling. All that could be heard was the distant murmur of the cave song. "I think it's high time this murderous abomination got what was coming to it," Maya finally said, voice full of uncharacteristic hardness. "I've got a score to settle." "I as well," Caleb said, all but vibrating with barely restrained feral rage. "You got my back, Mr. Caleb?" "Of course. Just stay out of my way." The battle broke out in an instant. Caleb and Maya were charging before Kendra could process what was happening, passing through the cloud of dust like specters. They came at the face-stealer from both sides, catching it between the hammer and the anvil, fury and control. Their dance was discordant and brutal. Caleb's berserker assault blurred across from Maya's elegant sway, and between them the monster jerked and bobbled drunkenly, a ragged banner in a gale, its thin, rasping laughter slowly rising. It was over as quickly as it began. Maya fell groaning to one side, and in another moment Caleb was thrown to the ground beside her. The face-stealer was giggling unsteadily now, and flexing its talons, dirty and razor-sharp, before approaching the two collapsed figures. Kendra thought of Thomas lying in his sick bed while she spoke over him, not knowing he would be dead within hours. She thought of the mycelite falling under its load. Kendra thought of Maya's easy smile, of Caleb's fierce protectiveness that hid his kindness, and she thought of Adrian, lying where she left him, small and alone. She was not sure when she had started moving. It seemed to have happened when she was not paying attention, perhaps slowly at first. It was fast now, very fast. She was covering the distance in a blur, moving in manic bounds as the face-stealer drew near to her fallen friends. And in the only intentional act of the mad dash, she reached down and caught them each under their collars. Moving on with a jolt, dragging them behind her with her muscles screaming, she approached the abyss, closed her eyes, and leapt. The ground rose up to meet her knees, casting her strewn upon the cool earth, shaking all over. The gentle smell of disturbed soil and mushrooms was soothing, like early morning in the garden back home. She lay groggily for several moments before returning to reality and scrambling painfully to her feet. She was badly bruised, her lips split, her knees and elbows skinned, but that did not matter. Hastily she turned to either side, and after a moment breathed a sigh of relief. Both her companions were there with her, battered but alive. With dread she turned, looking back to where the monster had been. The ledge she had flung herself off of was some 20 paces back. Her mind tried to grapple with some reckoning of the distance, some way she could have cleared the span, and she came up blank. It was incredible, miraculous. It was magic. She sat stunned for several long moments, trying to absorb the impossible, before something caught her gaze and jolted her from her reverie. Her eyes locked with Thomas's, though Thomas's eyes had never been so cold. It stood at the far ledge, almost like a person, its unmovable grin in place, a clawed hand on its cheek. And those eyes were no longer blank, empty voids. Kendra trembled, for she was certain that she had never seen such an expression before. It was as if a man had wandered for years without water, until his throat bled and he could cry no more, until he was no longer a man, until he was just his need. Those eyes held an absolute hunger that paralyzed her mind, chilled her to the bone. She tensed as she saw the face-stealer's posture change, arms and shoulders thrown back limply. "Aren't you ripening nicely, Kendra?" It rasped terribly with that voice that had nearly forgotten speech. She shrank back, and its grin spread further, near to the edges of its face. Then, with a sickening lurch, it flung itself over the divide. It was pure animal instinct that let her move at all. Her mind was numb with terror, but something in her body knew what to do. As the nightmarish figure hurtled at her, she wound herself into a taut coil. As her every instinct screamed to flee, something let her hold her ground. And as it came within reach, she leapt into the air to meet it. Its ghoulish grin was close, rows of pointed teeth gleaming, its claws whirling in a deadly blur. And with a sudden flash of fury, she kicked savagely at it with every bit of her strength. The arc of its leap abruptly reversed, and it was flung into the void, gibbering and cackling with some sort of hideous delight. She fell heavily back to the ground, dangerously near to the edge, but primal fear held her in place. She had to be sure. She watched it fall, until there came a dreadful sound of meat being rended. A large stalagmite had come beneath its drop, impaling it like some dreadful specimen in a display case. It jerked and thrashed, spattering black innards with its every movement. And still the face-stealer laughed and laughed. Kendra turned away from the chasm and tried to pull herself to her feet. She was surprised to find that she could not. She looked down and felt a dim confusion to see all that red. It was pouring out of her in a steady flow. She investigated, confused, noting the gaping and gushing hole that had been torn in her belly. Her shirt was now quite soaked, and the bleeding showed no sign of stopping. The claw had been so sharp, and her panic so great, that she had hardly felt it slash her open. Even now it was just a dull ache and an intense cold. Collapsing onto her back, she felt a faint sense of relief in spite of it all. Caleb and Maya would escape. They would tell the sisters of the familiars of what she had done. Surely this would atone for that, at least a little. "I wish I could have seen you one last time, Adrian," she thought, hazily regretful. "Sorry to always be running off like this. I hope you'll be all right." Then the pale glow of the mushrooms converged into a hazy gray, and she saw no more.